I will invite all the presenters to turn their camera off, and I'll start my presentation very briefly, because it's just a presentation on GI WACAF and what we do. So thank you very much. We are no more than 60 person in the room, and I'm starting my presentation, which is just just a small introduction about this webinar, which is, as I said, the fourth of the GI WACAF webinar series, and this one is on the at-sea response techniques. Just a few words about GI WACAF, because it's the project that is hosting this webinar. So the GI WACAF is in fact an acronym that stands for the Global Initiative for West, Central and Southern Africa. It's a project that was launched in 2006 by two organizations, the International Maritime Organization and IPCA, with the objective, which is to enhance the capacity of 22 partners countries in Africa. You have the map on the slide, to prepare for and respond to oil spills. It's very specific. We focus on oil spills, and to do so, we do organize activities such as workshops, trainings, exercises, and technical assistance activities, always together with the national authorities of these 22 countries. I wanted to summarize in a nutshell what the GI WACAF project is. You'll have the slides, so you could spend a bit more time on this, but very briefly. So it's a joint endeavor between the public and private sector. It supports 22 African partner countries. We do maintain a constant liaison with partner countries and between the industry and governments to provide tailored capacity building solutions. We do organize, as I said, workshops, training, courses, and exercises, encourage better communication and collaboration between governments and the industry, and encourage partner countries to ratify and implement international conventions, mainly stemming from the International Maritime Organization. As I said in the beginning, it's a series of webinars. So this one is the fourth one, and there will be other following this one, especially a webinar that should happen in the beginning of December on shoreline response. There will be complementary to this webinar on at-sea response. So briefly, the objectives of our webinar today on at-sea response techniques, it is obviously to gain an understanding of the available response techniques during an oil spill at sea, and it's very important to understand their key strengths and limits, gain knowledge of the available decision-making tools when choosing between the different techniques available, including NEBA and SIMA, and you'll know a bit more about these acronyms later, and gain knowledge on the challenges and successes faced when responding to an oil pollution at sea, thanks to case studies. And to do that, we have the chance today to have three international recognized experts with a first presentation that will be delivered by Lucy. She is a principal consultant at OSRL and will deliver a presentation on at-sea response techniques. And then a second presentation by Annabelle Nicola-Kopek. She's working for ITOPF as a senior technical advisor, and she will deliver a presentation on a case study. And last but not least, a presentation by Peter Taylor. Is a very well-known consultant in oil spill preparedness and response, and is also the project manager of a sister project of GI WACAF, which is called OSPRI, and he will deliver a presentation on decision-making tools such as NEBA and SIMA. So this is the end of my presentation. Obviously, you could have a look at our website, on the GI WACAF website, and if you want to have more information. Before we move to Lucy's presentation, I've prepared a very short poll just to know a little bit more about the audience, and I'm starting the poll right now. So it's basically a question. You should be able to see this question at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and it's a question to know if you're involved professionally in oil spill preparedness and response operations. I will just leave the the poll for 45 seconds, and then we'll share the results with you. I can see now that there is a vast majority of our participants today which are involved professionally in OSPRI preparedness and response operation, but I still give 15, 20 more minutes to the participants to answer. It's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. In case you're joining us right now, you could find the program and other useful documents to be downloaded in your files, and ask in the files tools, which is also on the right bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and use the chat to ask questions. So I will end the poll so we could start, and it's very interesting to see that 85% of the people who answered the chat are in fact working in the field of oil spill preparedness and response operations. So thank you very much all to answer for these answers. And Lucy, I will give you the floor to start with the first presentation of today. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Thanks, Julian. I'll just get my presentation up. Oh. Okay. I'm assuming everyone can see, unless Chloe in the control room tell me otherwise. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Julian kindly introduced me, I'm Lucy Short, and I'm from OSPRI Response Limited. So, oh, here we go. There we are. That's better. So, OSPRI Response is the largest international industry-funded oil spill response cooperative, which exists to respond to oil spills wherever in the world they may occur, by providing preparedness, response and intervention services. And we were established over 30 years ago. We have 12 locations around the world, including aircraft, subsea well services, offices and response bases. If you want any more information on Oil Spill Response Limited, please just head to the website. But I just wanted to give you a really quick introduction as to who we are. So let's move on to the key stuff. The aim of this at-sea response options presentation is to understand the main at-sea response options that may be used. The key learning objectives, as Julian alluded to earlier, are to name the primary at-sea response techniques that are available, to be able to explain when each might be used, explain each of their key strengths and limitations, and finally to explain the role of preparedness and to ensure a fast and efficient response at sea. So when there is a spill at sea, you need to be prepared and act fast. This includes what your options are. A response strategy is defined as a single strategy which is made up of a collection of response options or techniques. These are appropriate to the given circumstances and conditions. The tiered preparedness and response wheel, which you can see here on the right-hand side of your screen, highlights 15 response options that we can pick from to form our strategy. Physical response options are on the right-hand side of the TPR wheel, and these relate specifically to the front end of an oil spill. So, for example, it's from source control at the top all the way around to oiled wildlife, to shoreline cleanup and inland response. And then from oiled wildlife response through to environmental impact assessment, these are your support response options. And these relate to managerial and support activities. Today, we're focusing on just the 5 that I've highlighted on the TPR wheel. If you want any more information on the tiered preparedness and response wheel, then I'd have a look at the IPCA good practice guides, which I've referenced at the end of the presentation. So the first one we're going to look at is surveillance modelling and visualisation. Oops. Okay, here we go. So it's important for responders, government agencies and communities to have a clear understanding of the pollution situation and the response options that are underway, the progress that's been made to prevent or mitigate potential spill impacts. And this is called situational awareness. Monitor and evaluate should be used on every spill from the start all the way to the finish. Firstly, we need to know whether there is an oil spill or not. So sending a surveillance flight up to ensure the reports are correct will ensure we mount the correct response for the incident that we have. Surveillance can ensure that we have correct information on the location of the oil spill,
there's a small IT issue with Lucy. Bear with us. She should be back in just a moment. I think our connection has just was just not working. Thank you for your patience. And she's back with us. Thank you very much for your patience. And she's gone again. Sorry for this. In the meantime, as I said in the beginning, if you want to download the files, it's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You should have by now 3 different documents to download, including all the slides of the different slide decks of the different presentation today. You also have the GI WACAF brochure program for today, and Lucy's back.
Okay, I'm back.
Very good, Lucy. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Okay.
No worries.
Please carry on. Okay, so we'll just carry on. So surveillance can ensure that we have the correct information on the location of the oil spill, which can assist in deploying all of our valuable assets that we have. Surveillance can estimate the size of the spill, the quantity of the oil on the sea surface, which is not an easy thing to do. It's also important to send the same person, as different people will have different perceptions, which will mean you get different results. Depending on the incident, a flight may be able to pinpoint the origin of the oil spill by backtracking, and this will assist in understanding the size and complexity of the incident. So response modelling. Using modelling and surveillance combined, we can understand and plot the movement of the oil spill to determine whether the oil will impact land and where the possible locations might be that we may impact. And this will allow us to prepare our response operations and our equipment. There are several computer programs out there, OSCA and Oil Map, for example, that can determine the trajectory of the oil spill so that the planning section can prepare the resources to a particular area rather than covering a much larger shoreline, for example. As with all computer programs, what's input to the program must be correct as possible, otherwise the results may give you weak results or locations of spill impact. Modelling can also be used to backtrack to identify where a spill has originated from. Modelling can also be used in the preparedness phase, so during contingency planning to identify possible locations given a worst case spill, for example. And you can use probability graphs and the information to give you seasonal sites that you might see oil spill modelling, oil spill shoreline oiling occurring. So the next response technique that we want to talk about is containment and recovery. So with this technique, oil is removed from the marine environment through the controlled collection of oil on the water's surface into a boomed area. The aim is to coral the oil into the apex of the boom and increase the thickness of the surface oil to carry out effective skimming operations. The aim is to recover the oil and minimize the water intake. So, for at-sea containment and recovery, it can be used offshore or close to shore, reasonably close to shore. The rate of you can typically expect to recover less than 20% of the oil actually spilled. The rate of recovery is always overestimated, and the ease of collection at sea is always overestimated as well. Operations can be limited by the weather conditions. So ideally you need less than 20 knots of wind. Between 0 and 10 would be perfect. Not more than 1 meter wave height, which is around 3 to 4 foot, and not more than 1 knot of current speed. Also, because of safety, you can only operate in the daylight hours, so it depends where you are in the world as to how your window of operation could be. The deployment time is always underestimated. You need to look for your vessels of opportunity, you need to get the equipment to site, you need to get the vessels to site, and you need to set up, and it all takes a lot longer than anticipated. You also need to think about your oil storage, where, because of the waste chain, there's no point in collecting your oil and onto the vessels without thinking how you're going to take it away so that you can carry on with your response operations. Booms are used offshore for the containment of oil so that, depending on what method is used, recovery using a skimmer can be made more efficient as the booms concentrate the oil into the apex of the boom. The different types of boom that you can use are the inflatable boom. So these are sort of permanent inflation booms, such as the high sprint boom and the no-fee boom. You can get inflatable pocket sort of pillow booms, such as the row boom and the airflex boom. Other systems are the active boom system, which are weir boom type systems. You might have heard of the row skim boom. That's an example of one. And then you can have the high speed booms, which are your fast sweep systems, such as a no-fee current buster. The vessels of opportunity that you would need to use for these booms, you need to make sure that they have a good speed of maneuverability. You need to make sure they have deck space to store and deploy the equipment. They need to have good intership communications because often you have 2 or more vessels working in tandem together. A towing vessel would need to have a centre towing point to maintain storage, and often a high ab or something similar for the lifting equipment onto the vessel, and then again for deploying the equipment into the water. So these are all things that you need to consider when you choose your boom in a response or in the preparedness phase. What vessel are you going to be deploying it off? The types of offshore booming formations that I've alluded to. So from the top left, we've got the J formation. This is nice, simultaneous containment and recovery is possible. However, it provides a smaller encounter compared to a U formation, for example. The U formation, which is at the bottom left of your screen, provides a wide encounter with oil, but it's difficult to coordinate with vessels. As you can see, there's 3 vessels in the picture, 1 for the skimming operations and 2 for the booming control. It has a wide boom apex, so therefore the oil isn't quite concentrated into the apex as much as we may prefer, or as much as you may see with the V formation. And there's a lot of demand on resources and logistics to mount that response. The V formation, which is the bottom right of your screen, it has a wide encounter with the oil, but it has a narrow apex, which is good. It corrals all the oil into the back of the boom, and it assists in maximising the amount of oil that you can therefore recover. However, it is difficult to coordinate vessels. Again, you can see there's 3 vessels in the formation. It has a wide boom encounter, which makes it a little bit difficult to position all 3 of the vessels and then and then to recover the oil using the recovery device. And there is a lot of demand again on logistics and resources. The final image on the top right of your screen, that's the side sweep. This one's favourable with offshore vessels when they are supporting the rig or the operation or the vessel, the FPSO, for example, offshore. So there's less demand on logistics because it's only one vessel. It's quick to deploy, so if you have this system on your field supply vessel or fast support vessel, then they're on site already, so they can just launch it and get going with some recovery almost within a few hours. And it's easy to maintain its configuration whilst it's manoeuvring. However, the only drawback is that it's a small encounter. So moving on to the skimmers that will work in tandem with the booming. The different types of skimmers that you have available to you would be a weir skimmer, which sits on the oil-water interface. The oil allows, and basically the skimmer allows the oil to flow into the hopper over the top and is then pumped away to storage. It can work with light to medium oils, and they will recover emulsified oils and detergents, but will not affect recovery. So if you've used a dispersant, for example, it might not necessarily affect the recovery rate. However, it's only around 30% oil and 70% water recovery efficiency, and it is very sensitive to weather conditions, as you can see in that left-hand picture there. If you can imagine if it was wavy or choppy, then we're going to get a lot more water to oil ratio. The middle picture is an oleophilic skimmer. And these skimmers use discs, drums, or brushes which have an oleophilics, which is oil-loving properties. The oleophilic surface picks up the oil, which is later scraped off and pumped away into storage. Generally around 90% oil and 10% water recovery efficiency achieved with this type of skimmer. However, they can be damaged by dispersants. So as soon as you launch dispersant operations in the same area, then you're going to reduce the effectiveness of your oleophilic skimmer. And it's also has limited efficiency in emulsified oils. So the key with this one would be to use it as quickly as possible on the fresh oil. And then finally, your mechanical skimmer physically removes the oil from the water surface by nets, buckets, and drums. It can recover medium to heavy oils, but it needs a thick layer of oil to achieve maximum efficiency. It can recover emulsified oil, and it can tolerate debris, which is another good thing depending on where you are in the world. If you've got a lot of tree and seaweed and such debris around, but it may not be so efficient with recovering the light oils. So when you're thinking about what you need to have on board your field supply vessels and your support vessels, then you need to think, what is your product that you likely spill, and then the weather conditions, amongst many other factors. Okay. So the advantages and disadvantages of containment and recovery. Depending on the method used, offshore booming could collect fairly large amounts of oil. This amount depends on a lot of factors which can severely restrict the recovery rate. If the spill is instantaneous, by the time the vessels with recovery equipment can be organised and arrive on scene, the oil could be weathered and fragmented, which will hamper the recovery. If the weather is bad, vessels will not be able to do any. For example, in the Erika spill, oil was at sea for around 2 weeks, but only 15 hours of this, they were able to do offshore recovery because the weather was too bad, too windy, too rough. If the spill is continuous from a vessel or a rig, putting a boom around or downwind of the site will assist the containment and recovery and reduce the amount of oil that will be stranded on the coastline. Vessels must be able to be controlled at slow speeds due to the speed of the water flow into the boom. Even though a response at sea will be expected, historically only 10 to 20% of the oil spill will be recovered at sea due to varying factors. So the next offshore response technique on the tiered preparedness and response wheel is dispersants. And there are three methods of dispersant application offshore: aerial, vessel and subsea. So dispersants are comprised of surfactant compounds which are dissolved in solvents. When the surfactant is applied to the oil, the oleophilic part of the molecule bonds with the oil and the hydrophilic part bonds with the seawater. This forms small oil droplets with a larger surface area, which means that naturally occurring bacteria and oxygen in the water can work more readily on the oil in the water column, increasing the rate of biodegradation that would otherwise happen. The smaller dispersed droplets move into the water column to a depth of around 5 to 10 meters. Dispersant spraying increases the persistence of the oil in the environment, decreases the persistence of the oil in the environment, and the risk of oil impacting the shoreline decreases, and the volume of waste decreases. So some considerations when thinking about using offshore surface dispersants. You need to consider engaging with the authorities and the government officials in the preparedness and planning phase. This may help to speed up the dispersant use approval in the event of a spill. If you've already made those bridges and liaised with the right people and got some pre-approvals in place, it will facilitate and ease the process when you actually, hopefully not, but if you were to have a spill. You're typically only allowed to use dispersants offshore greater than 1 nautical mile or beyond the 2-meter depth contour. Sometimes additional restrictions apply in shallow or nearshore waters, depending on the specifics of the national policy which applies. Some types of dispersant you might come across, you might recognise the names. There's different, so you have type 1, type 2 and type 3. And these are generally accepted across from UK, France, Norway and Americas. I'm not saying they accept all of them, but these are examples of ones which have been potentially pre-approved in some of those countries. I won't dwell on this too much because I know Peter's going to talk to you about NEBA, but this can be a slide that you can come back to and refer to when you're looking at decision making. But the goal of a response team is to achieve the best results with the least impact. So the decision to use dispersants is a choice made after careful evaluation of many other factors. The goal is to help protect the shoreline, wildlife and other assets of value to the community, but this does involve some drawbacks. The main advantages of using dispersant: you can have a rapid response from vessels, helicopters, fixed wing aircraft, and so on, and they can bring a spill under control much more rapidly. Dispersants can be applied in rougher seas, so where your containment and recovery operations have to cease because the weather is too rough, too bad. Dispersant operations can continue for a bit longer, depending on what the wind speeds and the sea's roughness is. By dispersing the oil, it cannot strand on the beaches or coat seabirds, so its stickiness is reduced, preventing it adhering to suspended sediments, so it will not sink. If dispersants is applied to the emulsified oil, the emulsion can actually be broken, and it can be sprayed onto oil before emulsion to prevent an emulsion forming. By increasing the oil water surface area, biodegradation of oil by microbial activity is greatly enhanced. In the case of direct injection at the wellhead, the application rates can be reduced to 1 part dispersant, 100 parts oil or more, due to the efficient injection right at the source. So dispersant effectiveness, this one way to ensure that your dispersant is working and you aren't applying too much or too little is to conduct dispersant effectiveness monitoring in conjunction with your dispersant spraying operation. A word of warning, it can sometimes take up to 30 minutes to see visual indications and colour changes of the dispersant. So don't be too hasty in thinking that it's not working. Visual indications that the dispersant is effective is your middle pictures here. So a yellow sort of coffee grey colour plume is present in the water. The exact colour will vary depending on the original colour of the oil. And the oil spill surface area is greatly reduced on the water surface. You can visibly see that. Visual indications of overdosing, you'll get a milky white plume, which is effectively the dispersant in the water. And that indicates to you there's been too much being sprayed. Underdosing is recognisable through, basically you're not really seeing much change. Droplets, you can see they sort of reappear back on the water surface and recoalesce back together. A monitoring program is usually required. So fluorometry is an example of dispersant effectiveness monitoring that you would launch in conjunction with your dispersant spraying operations. So your offshore subsurface dispersants. For an ongoing subsurface release of oil, you may consider subsurface dispersant injection. This uses an ROV to apply dispersant via a wand directly into the flow of a gushing wellhead. Why would you choose to inject a subsea dispersant? Generally to create a safer surface working area for the response personnel up on the surface, so either your rig or the spill source on the water surface, so above the spill source, or the vessels up on the water surface. It's a safer environment because there's less gases and less of the oil reaching the surface. It reduces exposure of surface vessels to the volatile organic compounds, reduces the need for surface response operations, and therefore the risk to personnel from accidents carrying out these operations. And it minimises the environmental impact by enhancing the degradation of oil whilst operations are ongoing to stop the leak. You need to consider that a large amount of dispersant would be needed per day, around 150 metres cubed per day to inject. You would need to mount effectiveness monitoring, as we discussed just now, and some environmental monitoring. And the premium guidelines would be a good source of information for you to look at there. That's premium. In situ controlled burning, this is the final response technique we'll talk about today. The advantages of mounting of doing in situ controlled burning is that it has high removal rates. You're removing the oil from the water surface, so typically around 95 to 98%. It reduces the need for recovered oil storage, transfer and disposal, which is a huge logistical operation that you'd need to think about for your containment and recovery technique. There's less response resources, but it really does have specialised equipment that you would need to do this technique, and it requires training on the water or on land. It's relatively fast and relatively low cost. Some disadvantages that you would need to consider is that it often does not form part of a national contingency plan. Often it's not really considered until the event, for example. So therefore it can be a little bit difficult to obtain the necessary approvals. It has a time window, requires ideal weather conditions. Fire booms are really expensive and have a limited period of use, so generally they're not reusable either. So you need to consider that when you're purchasing your stockpile of equipment. The big smoke plumes, as you can see in this picture, they cause public immediate discontent if they're too close to shore or inland, for example. And they may be seen as transferring the pollution from the sea to the air. So these are lots of things that you would need to consider before mounting this technique. And one might argue, if you've got perfect weather conditions, why would you therefore not be doing your containment and recovery, your traditional containment and recovery? So the final aspect of this presentation is to explain the role of preparedness to ensure a fast and efficient response at sea. Tiered preparedness and response provides a structured approach to establishing oil spill preparedness and a mechanism to build the required response effort. The 3 levels or tiers provide a simple structure from which the oil spill response capabilities can be identified to mitigate any potential oil spill scenario. Response capabilities are defined as the resources required to deal with the spill incident and can be broadly considered into 3 categories: your response personnel, the equipment, and your additional support. Preparedness is a fundamental element of establishing a strong response framework that is capable of dealing with a range of oil spill scenarios as defined in your spill risk assessment. Underpinning tiered preparedness and response is a requirement for all the tiered response capability to be able to work together towards a common goal. Effective contingency plans ensure the success and safety of a response by clearly communicating the roles and responsibilities of all those organisations and personnel who may be involved. Training and exercising is key, and it underpins the contingency plan and being able to deliver the response. Encompassed under that, for example, the webinars that are going on with GI WACAF now, the training tools that you can access, these are all great tools for you to increase your preparedness and to update your contingency plans and your emergency response plans, for example. So just to kind of summarise, the main aim of the presentation was to understand the main at-sea response options that may be used. And each of these resources that I've put on here, they're just an example of the range that you can refer to when creating your oil spill preparedness programme. If you visit the Oil Spill Response website, there's technical handbooks that you can look at there. The IPCA Good Practice Guides I've referenced here that I've spoken about in this presentation. And there are a whole host of other online resources that you can use as well.
So thank you very much, Lucy, for your very comprehensive presentation. Before we move to the next presentation, I will just start a small poll or quiz, just which will be available on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. It's just a very simple question that is, and the response was indeed in Lucy's presentation. So it's just a small quiz related to this presentation. If you could you see the quiz on the bottom right of your screen? If you could see the screen, then there's the quiz. Sorry, please answer and give an answer. There's no ways to try. I will give you 30 seconds to answer this before we move on to the next presentation presented by Annabelle from ITOPF. Again, for those who are joining us right now, you could download all the presentations, all the slide decks, and useful documentation in the Files tab of your Webinar Jam platform, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. It includes some of the good practice guides that have been mentioned by Lucy during her presentation. So I see that more and more answers are coming regarding the current poll. I give you another 15 seconds before we close the poll and move to the next presentation, because I'm very much conscious of the time and like to have enough time to give some time at the end of the webinars for Q&A. So here it is. I will close the poll in 5 seconds. It will be just around a minute. Okay, so the poll is closed. You should be able to see the results in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen again. And indeed, 68% of you answered that it's around 15%. That's correct. It's the usual the average rate of oil recovered during containment and recovery operation. Just it's the good answer. Thank you very much for this. I will now give the floor to Annabelle for a presentation, which is a case study on at-sea response techniques. And Annabelle, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm just putting the presentation on. Just bear with me, please. All right. Right, good afternoon everyone. So as Julien introduced me, I'm Annabelle Nicolas-Kopek. And I'm a senior technical advisor at ITOPF. I've been working for ITOPF for 10 years now. And before I start this case study on the at-sea response, focusing particularly on the at-sea response, I would like to introduce really briefly ITOPF for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So we are a non-profit making organization, and over 52 years, we have been responding to spills and incidents from ships involving not only oil, but also HNS, dangerous cargo, and food products. We are funded by the global shipping industry. And we have responded in total over like 800 spill over the 50 years of existence in around 100 countries. Actually, the 100th country was Togo a few years back. The technical team is made of 15 responders like myself, all scientists, so chemists, marine biologists, for example. And we available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and obviously all year long. In general, we tend to respond to around 20 incidents a year, and in this COVID time, it remained more or less the same where we go on site. But we also do some remote advice, around 30 remote advice a year. So now to dive in straight into the case study, I have put here some image where you can see the AAS tracks of the two ships that collided off the coast of Corsica, which is the land at the bottom of the image in the south of France, and created the incident I'm going to talk to you about today. The collision is just right at the border between the French and Italian water. So you see, like in red, surrounded like the vessel IS track. On the bottom left, while one of the ship, the container vessel, is at anchor, the one at the bottom, the other one, the raw ferry, collide with that container ship at more than 19 knots. And you can see here in the picture the result of the collision, with the two boats really wedged into each other. While the ferry did not sustain any damage on his bunker tank, over almost 700 cubes of heavy fuel, MFO 380, that was on board the container ship. It was estimated that around 550 cubes were lost at sea from the container ship as a result of the collision. It is important to note that often it takes a long time to obtain the bunker certificate and the exact property of the fuel. So the first actions at sea are often based on generic properties of fuel oil. In our case, it took a bit of time to get access to the composition of the fuel oil. ITOPF were able to obtain them firsthand by the ship owner. And as we were integrated in the command center, we were able to pass them on directly to the authority as soon as we got them. Here on this picture, you can see the extent of the damage sustained on both of the ship. On the top image, you can view the bow of the ferry in white and the resulting containment of hydrocarbon in the cargo hold. And then at the bottom, you can see the view of the vessel taken during a dive inspection. And that shows the forepeak of the ferry, which is on the left, wedged into the container vessel and resting on its starboard anti-roll choke. 4 days after the collision and after several rescue attempts, the vessel separated without assistance, actually, but due to the combined force of the rough sea and the previous attempt by the salvors to dislodge them. The ferry on the right was able to leave without assistance, but the container ship, well, had this obvious hole on the starboard side. Here you can see the appearance of the slick at sea on the day of the collision. You can see the slick and continuous slick, but I wanted to show you a bit the aspect of the slick over time and how that can impact the cleanup strategy. And while we had a nice and continuous slick, over time, oil weather, the lighter portion of the oil will evaporate, and due to the combined force, action of wind and current, the slick will stretch, will fragment, will emulsify. And then you can see that quite clearly in the picture of day +2 and day +3 and day +5. And that, as I say, implied change in the cleanup strategy. And I'm going to come back to that. In terms of organization, the response at sea was coordinated in France, in Toulon. But due to the fact that the incident was offshore, it had the particularity to having an unseen commander, an OSC, on board of one of the ETV, which coordinated the action of the vessel on the zone. And that has caused delays in some communication and some issues that need to be sorted out to have a common strategy. As previously shown by the location of the incident, the regional agreement, the Ramos-Paul, was activated. And so that helped to mobilize resources from Italy, and Italy did some all the coordination in the Italian water. As with any response, there are points of improvement that can be highlighted. In terms of organization, it's worth noting that under the French system in place, at-sea response operation are military-led, so it's the Marine and the Préfecture Maritime, but the pollution experts are civilians. And that has led to problems, particularly to access documents, and therefore delays in the advice given. In addition, we saw that the Italian representative were only present at the command center only after 4 days after the beginning of the incident. And that has led as well for difficulty to obtaining information about what was happening on site from the Italian, what was their strategy. And so adjusting like a common strategy between the French vessel and the Italian vessel had to be worked out. So I mentioned the vessel. Sorry. In terms of assets deployed, there were more than 34 French and Italian vessels involved in the cleanup effort. In addition, we also had the EMSA anti-pollution vessel Brezza Mare that was mobilized. You can see in the picture on the right the diversity of the fleet with big ETVs, but also tug and patrol boats. On the graph on the left, you can see the number of vessels mobilized by France in blue and by Italy in orange during the 3 weeks of the at-sea response. And you can kind of clearly see like 2 phases that I will talk about in a minute. But with the mobilization phase and the demobilization phase quite clearly. So the at-sea response were really divided into these two phases. The first one, as the property of the oil were not compatible with the use of dispersant, we had a heavy fuel. The response really was organized around one technique, the containment and recovery of the oil by large ETVs and support vessels. Oh, that's in phase one. And the picture I've put here illustrates the different containment method utilized during the response, with some deployment U-shape boom, or deployment of boom in the U configuration, sorry, or the use of sweeping arm from vessels. And the second part, obviously, containment and recovery is a recovery, and this was done with either skimmers, and you can see a picture on the top left, skimmers, you can see a skimmer at sea, together with the one at the bottom, and also the use of some special trolling nets over there. I think Lucy mentioned it earlier in the talk, but of course, aerial support in those big at-sea response operation is quite paramount. And in our case, more than 11 aircrafts were involved in the cleanup response with different tasks, some to transfer personnel to site, some for aerial observation, and some for security. But approximately 2 flights a day were used for repositioning the vessel of the day, so to ensure the vessel was the right spot to pick up as much oil as possible, and the middle of the day. However, what we saw is it was quite lengthy for the experts to receive those data, and so our advice was not as reactive as we would have liked because of the delay for us to obtain this data. After 10 days of response, there was a drone was used, actually a UAV was used and set up on board ATV for faster guidance of the response vessel, particularly when you have to deal with smaller slicks and patches. You have to remember it's quite difficult to have a good visibility of the slick from the deck of a vessel, particularly when you're offshore. Obviously, there is other technology you can use to help the at-sea response, and one of them is the use of satellite imaging. At the beginning of the response, the weather was actually quite good, and that allowed for the use of satellite image to observe the pollution. So you can see here the satellite photo obtained by ITOPF, which show the presence of a slick at the day of the collision, so with day +1, so the day after the collision. You can clearly see some oil escaping from the container ship. Then in day +2, I have superimposed the image of the following day, so day +2, that show the progress of the pollution over 24 hours. This pollution is visibly moving away from Corsica, which is the land on the bottom right, but is moving clearly toward the Italian and the French coast. In the following day, the weather was not so good, and inclement weather meant that satellite images were not exploitable. So the Command Center had to use modelization, and the model choose was the MOTE model developed by Météo France, and the outcome was also cross-referenced with NOM model, which was developed by NOAA, which ITOPF also used, and both proved to be very accurate. You can see in the picture the black and the red dot, that those are the prediction, I mean the probability of presence of oil according to 2 different scenarios. And I'm not going to go too much into detail, but yeah, those models were extremely accurate actually. And so that was for day +5. And when we keep running the model throughout the response, we saw that actually the predictions were coming really close. What was really clear is that the pollution followed the Ligure currents, and I tried to draw this pretty ugly, I'm sorry, yellow arrow that shows the Ligure current, which follow the Mediterranean basin from east to west, basically. That's the final model that we run for D+9, which predict an arrival of pollution on the shoreline on the 9th day of the incident. And I will show you later that that is exactly what happened. So the inclement weather meant that there was quite a limited use of equipment on a few days, despite the presence of assets on site, and there is a bit of damage of equipment. We also saw, and earlier in the talk, I showed the fragmentation of the slick and the pollutant coming much closer to the coast, meaning that the strategy in place in the phase 1 wasn't really suitable anymore. The ETV couldn't go so close to the coast. So they had to, the Command Center had to change strategy. And that change of strategy was more matching a coastal response with use of smaller vessel, small trawls, and also scoop, for example, which is a much tedious manual work and involve recovery of smaller quantity as well. It's a more thin response. But as I mentioned, despite best efforts, at sea response is never 100% efficient. You're all like majority of you responded that only 15% of oil at sea is usually being picked up, and at sea response is rarely the end of cleanup operation, particularly because only a small part of it can be collected. So it's typically followed by a response on the land, especially if the incident is close to the shoreline. So in our case, as the model predicted, the first arrival on the French coast, we saw some tarball arriving on the French coast. On this map, you can see the first arrival was on day 1. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a bit of water for my throat, sorry. Thank you. So the more heavily impacted shoreline was the one that was impacted first at day 9 and day 10, and you can see in the Var region over here, followed by the whole south coast of France, with arrival of tarball over a few days and up to a few weeks, up to the border with Spain, actually completely in the west. And as I mentioned, the most impacted area was the first one, which was oil, which is the Gulf of Saint-Tropez. For those familiar with this French region, it's also called the French Riviera, and it attracts more than 1.6 million tourists a year. On the top right is the beach of Pampelonne on the Ramatuelle city, with more than 4 kilometers of sandy beach over there, and you can see like the mega yacht that are anchor of the beach. The Var region that's the numbers we had for 2012, but more than 9 million tourists a year, and that represents almost 6 billion in the French economy. So you can imagine the impact of such arrival of oil in this region could have economically. And this is an aerial photo of Pampelonne Beach that I showed you a bit earlier, from the air on the left and from the shore during a shoreline survey we did, with the arrival of the first tarball. You can see on the first picture in the surf zone, you can see like some sheen and some true color oil, showing that the oil really about to land on the beach. And on the right, you can see tarball and patties on the sand, but also mixed with a lot of Posidonia and debris that were brought up as well by the Ligure current. Now, I think that's more or less conclude the at-sea response when once we have reached that stage and the oil reached the shoreline. But once the at-sea response is completed or near submission, one aspect not to neglect is the cleaning of the assets and the waste management. Operation at sea can generate a large quantity of liquid and solid waste, oil or unoiled. Some equipment can be cleaned, but some will have to be replaced. And a cleaning operation is not something that is insignificant and can require the heavy logistic that needs to be taken into account. Particularly because, if the at-sea response is going to last over a long period of time, the logistic of unloading the waste, cleaning and repairing equipment is quite essential for the continuation of the response operation and can halt this operation. You also want to ensure that the assets are ready as soon as possible for the next incident. In this case, we had more than 1,500 cubes of waste that was recovered on board the vessel involved. So you can imagine how that need to be treated and finding the relevant waste management treatment. Here, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the cleaning of like a big ETV like the one I have on top right might involve in terms of logistics aspect and the time and the cost required. So, of course, you have to take into account the human resource, the team that need to carry out the work, but also the rental of the equipment needed, vacuum truck, high pressure cleaner, PPE, obviously, and all the consumable. The process can be quite long and quite expensive, depending on the vessel and the range. And it can range from 3,000 euro from a Zodiac for a few days of cleaning to almost 10 times that price for a large ETV. So you can see, for a Zodiac, few days, in that example here, like this big ETV needed more than a month of work. If you consider the tank cleaning and the hull cleaning, the main deck and everything, that's a huge logistical operation. So in this case, actually, it's quite important to note that the cost of the cleaning and the replacement of the equipment was actually done quite quickly, as it was dealt directly through the insurer. And so that ensured that the assets were ready in like a relatively fast time for potentially be mobilized for another incident. And so to conclude on this at-sea study, this was quite an efficient at-sea response. Obviously, you've seen mobilizing a lot of means. That's not always like possible for a lot of countries. But it certainly had helped and mitigate the impact of oil reaching the shoreline. What we saw is that the collision happened in October 2018, but actually a month before there was a Ramoshpol, this regional agreement consortium, that had an exercise just south of the location incident. And so the main player already knew each other. They knew the assets available at the time. And of course, like this preparedness aspect and the fact they knew each other and they trained for it, has certainly played a great role in the success of this at-sea response. That's it for me. I obviously show you just like one part of this case study, the at-sea response I focus on. But should you be interested to hear about what happened on the shoreline, and it lasted for the cleanup lasted for a long time, I will invite you. I will promote the next GI WACAF on the shoreline cleanup for the next step of the story. And I will be happy to answer to any of your questions after the end of the talks.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, for this very interesting case studies. And it's very interesting to see how it happens in reality after Lucy's presentation, presenting the main techniques. So thank you very much for this. It was very interesting. Before we move to the final presentation by Peter on NEBA SIMA, I just wanted to launch a very short poll again, just to ask a very simple question. It is regarding your familiarity with NEBA SIMA decision-making tools. So I've started the poll It will last again for around a minute. It's again in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Just to ask you if you're familiar with NEBA, SIMA as decision-making tool. Thank you for the answers. I'm just, in the meantime, preparing Peter's presentation. So I got a lot of answers on the poll. Thank you for this. Just maybe 10 more seconds, and we will close the poll. Okay, thank you very much. The results should be at the very same place where the poll was, so you can see that it's very interesting. It's very different from the French speaking audience we had this morning, which was not really familiar with NEBA SIMA. Here we can see that 50% of the respondents are aware of at least the acronym. So Peter, I give the floor to you to explain this a little bit more. And again, this is the last presentation before we move to the Q&A. Thank you, Peter. You have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Julien. And hello to everyone. Great to be here. Those of us, I guess, which is many of us living under these current restrictions, we're missing human contact. We stuck in these weird boxes, but I'm actually speaking to you from West Wales. Shout out to West Wales, land of song, castles. What else? Gareth Bale, famous for its football now. But I'm sure there are people from all over the globe, and at least half of you are going to find this useful then, judging by that poll. I'm going to talk about these two acronyms, and I've said hello, I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to turn off my video just because out in deepest West Wales, we do get some connectivity issues occasionally. So I'll continue just with the audio if that's okay with you. You don't have to look at me. The two acronyms here, one of them, the NEBA one, Net Environmental Benefit, is probably more familiar to you than the second one, but I'll go through them both and hopefully explain how they are related to each other, very closely related. A little bit of the history book, first of all. The origins of this NEBA acronym, where does it come from? Well, it goes back a few decades now, and it was a term that really came to prominence in our oil spill context with the spill in Alaska in 1989. You can see on the screen there the US technical experts from the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, so the key oil spill specialists in the USA still. They analysed the pros and cons of aggressive shoreline cleanup treatment that had been proposed by the state of Alaska, actually, to get the oil out of these bouldery beaches. And they looked at as I say, the pros and cons, and concluded that the damage that would be likely to be caused by the proposed treatment, which was quite aggressive, was greater than the benefit of removing the oil. So instead, the options of flooding and recovering the oil from the released oil from the beach, or leaving the sites to nature, was ultimately preferred. And that's a shoreline example. And of course, the context of this webinar is primarily offshore. And the next one, as we heard from Julien at the beginning, is focusing on shoreline. But in truth, what I'm going to speak about in this presentation actually cuts across all aspects of response strategy, including the on water as well as the shoreline considerations. And in the wake of the developments of this NEBA approach, ITOPF, one of the organizations you've heard about a little bit already, they created a publication that captured the concept of NEBA, and it was very aptly titled, you see it down in the bottom right there, Choosing Spill Response Options to Minimize Damage, which kind of says that's the description on the tin really for NEBA. That's what it's all about, and nobody really can argue against that as an aspiration. You want to respond in the best way that is is possible and causes the minimum amount of damage. So there it is. There's the label on the tin, as it were. That's the definition of NEBA. It is a straightforward one. Over the years, some of you may appreciate probably, there have been some criticisms of what I'll call the optics of this term NEBA, with views expressed that there's no benefit when you have an oil spill, notwithstanding that the optimal mix of response techniques can clearly be beneficial compared to a suboptimal approach to responding. And in reality, the term net benefit, it's effectively the same as maximum mitigation or minimizing damage. These are synonyms for the same concept. But as I say, really, some people have not really felt comfortable with the word benefit in the title, which is one of the reasons for the evolution of the new term SIMA, which we'll come on to. It is important just down the bottom there on the screen to incorporate that one of the aspects of NEBA that is really quite important and needs emphasizing is that it's an opportunity to engage with stakeholders who can come in various guises, as we'll talk about in a moment. And this includes the opportunity to get input to the process of choosing the best options, and also even raising awareness amongst the stakeholders on why and how you can justify a proposed response strategy. So I move on to this second four-letter acronym, Spill Impact Mitigation Assessment, SIMA. You can view that as a synonym for NEBA. It's kind of describing the same thing, or it could be viewed as a tool to carry out NEBA. It's in terms of the published documentation that IPCA have now developed, which I'll share with you at the end. It's kind of a how-to guide. How-to being how to undertake and put into effect in your decision making the principles of NEBA. Now that can be ideally part of contingency planning. So when you're putting together how to respond and what resources to identify or to establish to enable you to respond to an incident, or the same principles can be used during an actual response. We just heard about a response from Annabelle, and in some cases, as on the screen there, the response strategy kind of defines itself because you've only got certain things you can do. If the oil is highly viscous and cannot be dispersed, then dispersants is not an option. Or if it's a small spill in an enclosed harbour, it may be obvious that you're just going to go and try and contain and recover it, because that could be very successful. So in some cases, you don't need a formalized process like I'm going to introduce here with the SIMA process. But in other cases, that is needed. I think we all know that large spills are very rare, and primarily these tools of developing response strategy are targeted at those more complex and larger incidents in the planning phase. I would say that there is a kind of a however from me here, and we've seen this in recent incidents, and that's the increasing use of social media and its related ability to spread what shall I call misinformation. SIMA provides a transparent communication tool, so that can shine a light on possibly contentious response issues, such as the use of dispersants or controlled burning of spilled oil. And this dialogue process, the shining a light, the engagement, the explanation element, even your experts might say, well, it's obvious how we're going to respond because we've done spills like this before. Yeah, spills are different, but in certain locations, an expert could probably tell you what is the suitable or best way to respond, but that needs communicating and justifying to the local community, or if you're from an industry side, you need to justify that to the authorities, the regulators, as well as the broader stakeholders and those who may be affected by the spill. So increasingly in the world we live, of course, communication and perception is important, and the SIMA tool can be a way to address that and engage with that reality. And here is the methodological process, 4 stages, and I'm saying the 4 stages of SIMA. If you look at the NEBA documentation that IPCA have produced, they have exactly the 4 same stages. So SIMA is analogous and entirely linked to, and as you say, could be viewed as a methodological process of implementing NEBA. So I don't have time in this presentation to go through a scenario in the detail, but I do want to introduce the stages that are on the screen. And the stage 1, the evaluation of data, that means choosing credible and representative oil release scenarios as part of a risk assessment in the contingency planning context, modeling their fate and trajectory, and determining what that might result in terms of damage to or impacts to environmental, ecological, or socioeconomic or cultural resources that may be at risk from that scenario that we're considering based on our modeling of trajectory and fate. Then we can go on to the predicting the outcomes. Well, what does that mean in terms of impacts and damage? So that is an assessment of the spill's impact if there were to be no intervention, no response. In the theoretical situation that we did nothing, what would be the impact? Then we can extend that prediction to, well, suppose we did respond, bearing in mind, and you heard from Lucy some of the pros and cons or benefits and drawbacks of the different response options. How would they modify the impact? How would they change the outcome if we were to use those tools, bearing in mind their feasibility and limitations in the context of the location and the scenario that we are analyzing or assessing? In most cases, of course, we would hope that the modification, and compared to no intervention, would be a kind of good one, a positive one. That would be a mitigation of impact or a reduction of impact. But we do know that some response options can also increase the impact to some resources. We saw the black smoke, for example, from the burning going up from, so we're converting the marine pollution on the surface. Some of that oil is going into soot and causing atmospheric pollution. Or if we successfully chemically disperse oil from the surface, that oil is going into temporarily increasing the concentration of oil in the surface waters. So there is that, and that can have an impact on marine ecology. And when we get that transient increase in concentration of oil in the water beneath where the floating slick was. So we do have to, the process has to take that into account, and that leads to the 3rd stage, the balancing of those trade-offs, where analyses are made of the impact mitigation potential for each response option compared to no intervention. And this is a good point where there's an opportunity for dialogue with the key stakeholders. And that puts really right onto the table, no longer under the table, but on the table, the issues. So if people are skeptical or misunderstanding of things like dispersants, then there can be an engagement and an explanation and a description and hopefully come to a consensus and common understanding of those benefits and limitations, and sensible decisions can be made in the light of that. That knowledge that we have of the impacts and the potential for mitigation of these various response techniques are that they're grounded in a really extensive body of study and research now that extends back, gosh, 20, 30, 40 years now. We do know a lot about the impacts of oil and dispersed oil and on the different aspects or compartments of the environment. But we also need to understand the value that a community is placing on the different resources that may be predicted to be affected by our modelling, because that does vary from location, within location and region. So this is a science-based approach, but it also has to understand what the priorities and values of a local community, what they are. And this can be worked into the SIMA process and adjustments made in the light of local context, aligned to the national values or the values in that particular region. And the final stage, the selection of best options, is derived from the ranking that the process gives us for each of the response techniques and their mitigation potential. And clearly those options that have the most impact mitigation potential, those that can give us our best outcome, are the ones that we are going to want to put to the top of our list of preferred techniques. And typically the outcome is not to rule out options. You might rule out an option if it's not feasible. If the weather's too bad, you can't do water collection containment, for example, or if the oil is not dispersible, you can't disperse it. But generally speaking, unless an option is ruled out for operational or safety reasons, really we're looking at this giving us a prioritization. Where do we put our focus? We're not choosing the best response technique. We're choosing primary and supplemental techniques and prioritizing where we put our planning effort and how we put our resource of planning and the resources and stockpiles, etc., how they are balanced and where they're located, etc. That's really what this process is aiming to give us as an outcome. So who's involved? I talked about stakeholders, and the dialogue is really very important, and the stakeholders will vary but can encompass industry, government, the local community, and those whose livelihoods may be affected. During the dialogue, sharing good practice and awareness raising can be employed. It's a good opportunity to do that if needed. Educating people is sometimes needed. And if there are misunderstandings about the benefits and limitations of response options, this is the point that can be discussed and explained. And really the point here is to be realistic and pragmatic, encouraging approaches that are realistic and pragmatic. In the case of, if we move from planning to a real incident, of course, then time is critical. And some of the more consensual, discussing workshop-y type approaches that can be employed during planning are not appropriate to a real incident. And they need a much more expedited, rapid process. And curtailing the dialogue to some degrees is inevitable. So there are differences between planning and response, but mainly driven by the imperative of time and rapid response. So what's this complicated diagram on the screen? Well, really at the heart of the SIMA approach is this what's called a comparative matrix. And just very briefly to talk this through, it's used to present the outcomes of the process that I've just described, those 4 stages really, or certainly 3 of the stages, and then it leads into the 4th stage. Here you can see how the impacts on resources at risk, and the resources at risk I've highlighted them there also on the left-hand side. You have these environmental compartments, and they are really quite broad environmental compartments. They're assessed for a given scenario. And the initial column, you can see it there, is the no intervention column. That would be the relative impact on these different environmental compartments if there were to be no intervention. Subsequent columns estimate the mitigation potential for each of the feasible response options for each resource compartment. So it sounds a little bit complicated, but actually in principle, it's as I've just described. We're looking at the resources at risk and then looking at how the various feasible response techniques can change the outcome, mitigate the impact. In the majority of cases, sometimes that mitigation can be negative, which means you're actually making the problem worse. But on balance, you would hope that all the techniques would give you a mitigation, overall mitigation when we look across or down the rows for all of the different environmental compartments. And note that this process is quite high level and ultimately quite qualitative. There can be challenges from some stakeholders that the process is actually too simplistic, and we need more detail because more detail gives more accurate outcome. And some NEBA methodologies are much more detailed than this, going down to species analysis, modeling the impacts on resources, not just modeling the trajectory of the scenario that we've chosen, but actually modeling into impacts on the various resources. And this can become extremely time-consuming and expensive. And personal view, warning that, and my view is that I would challenge that this, whether it ultimately gives a better outcome. It won't necessarily give a worse outcome, but you can spend a lot of time and money getting to the same place. Bear in mind, we're not undertaking a resource damage assessment here. We're just trying to identify which are the response techniques that we would prioritize use of. So in that context, I think something at this level of complexity probably fits, well, I would argue it fits quite nicely, suitable for helping decision makers and suitable for communicating to those who are interested or have a stake in the outcome of the process. So selecting the best options. Here we're talking about either in the planning or the response stage. We're looking at how we utilize our tiered preparedness and response, where we have employed our acquisition of resources and capability and establish that capability. For example, if dispersants are identified as a primary tool for offshore, as they frankly often are, then stockpile spraying systems and application platforms need to be in place. So as do the regulations to approve those dispersant products and the authorization of their use. So coming to the summary, the key features here, these are interrelated to some degree. The method, I want to emphasize here, the method does not claim to calculate a correct response. It just guides and based on the best information that we have and analyzed to a suitable level of complexity, and including often a dialogue with those people who have an interest in the outcome, you can end up with a suitable response strategy. And this includes the challenge of weighing the value of ecological and socio-economic considerations in the round. You know, to one extent, we are comparing apples and oranges when we look at ecological concerns versus economic or socio-economic, tourism, fishing, etc. concerns. But that's the reality of what the challenge that an oil spill raises. And it allows inputs from both the experts and local community. And I hope, if it's done properly, that the process should be blind to any preconceptions about response techniques, and in an objective manner consider the benefits and drawbacks of each of the response techniques and allow flexibility to local concerns. So the publications, if you would like more information, these are two key reference documents. I think the one on the left is posted in the files for this talk. Both of these documents are available on the IPCA or the IOGP websites. And the IPCA website there is ipica.org, familiar to some of you. So those documents that Lucy showed, all the IPCA oil spill publications are available on ipica.org. And you can navigate in the publications and find them all, or just search NEBA or SIMA if you want these two documents. So that's my summary there. I think I am done. I notice we're actually come to the end of our 90 minutes. I'll hand directly back to you then, Julien, and see how if you want to extend time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation on NEBA and SIMA. I hope these acronyms are now much clearer for all the audience. Indeed, we are reaching the end of this webinar, but I'd like to allow 5 more minutes for to handpick some of the questions. I've seen in the chat that many questions have already been answered by our experts, and I thank you for the questions and answers because we don't have much time. Just a few questions that I can read here. I will try to redirect them to the most to the person it they should be asked to. I'm trying to choose the first question. Just bear with me have to go through the chat. There's a question from Ravi Naika from South Africa. We know him very well in the GI WACAF project, so hi Ravi. Glad to have you here. And this question is there a table or index that responders can use for the type of HFO and the dispersant to use? Lucy, maybe you want to answer that question as it's directly linked to your presentation.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't had much time to prepare for it, but I think that the EMSA website would probably be your best port of call. I can just do a little bit more research for you and get you the link for that if you want.
Yeah.
But that's probably the best answer I can give you right now, if that's okay.
Yes,
maybe if I can add, I'm not aware of an index as such, but as Lucy has presented, you will typically have rule of thumb for the oil that can be dispersible depending on the viscosity. So under 10,000 centi-stroke, for example, is something like to be considered. Under 5,000 is likely to be dispersible. Between 5,000 and 10,000 is it has to be seen, and over, if it's too viscous, is unlikely to work. But in any case, you will unlikely to start doing a big dispersant operation without doing a trial anyway first. So that will be the first port of call anyway. If you think that an oil may be dispersible, then you will do a trial with a small dispersion in a bottle or something, and so you can see if that's working. Yeah, just as a complement to what Lucy was saying.
Thank you very much, Lucy and Annabelle, for your answers. Last question. Maybe I will direct that question to Peter. It's from Mr. Theodore Pay. And his question is more on contingency planning than at-sea response technique, but anyway, I think it's an interesting one. He asks, when oil spill occurs from oil wells, which contingency plan must be used, national one or the oil field contingency plan? I think that's a very interesting question, Peter, if you'd like to say a word or two on this one.
Yeah, I would say both. If that's a cheating answer. Just by coincidence, I was involved in a very large exercise in the UK here last week with an oil well operator who had a major release, and they for sure used suite of plans, actually, their oil field plan, the plan for their onshore operations that supported that, and then a kind of corporate plan that brought in expertise to assist the UK operation. So that there were a number of operators' plans, but in parallel with that, the UK government activated the national plan, which brought together all the different agencies from the Coast Guard to the offshore regulator to coordinate their response in partnership with the response, oversight and partnership with the response from the operator. So I would not see them in any way isolated. The oil field plan should be produced so it integrates into the national plan. So for me, it's both.
I agree as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter and Lucy, for the answers. I think that's very comprehensive and directly in line with what we are with what we usually disclose and say during our trainings in GI WACAF. So thank you very much for this. This will be the last answers. I would like to thank you all participants and experts alike for attending this webinar, answering questions, asking questions. Thank you from Wales and abroad. Again, if you want to share files or download files rather, they are still available in your webinar tool. On this, I would like to say thank you all and goodbye. Just one thing, maybe. There is, as Annabelle pointed out, there will be another webinar on shoreline response techniques that will happen in beginning of December. So it will complement this one, And during this next webinar, we'll therefore focus on what happens when the oil reaches the shore, which is a complete different story. So thank you very much all. And this time I think it's time to say goodbye.